the turn of the 20th century, U.S. citizens liked to collect and trade photographs of what they called typical American scenes. One popular image was the before and after picture of an indigenous person, pictured first in native clothing and then in Euro-American clothes. This picture told a seemingly innocent story of the successful conversion of a native child from her own way of life into an assimilated member of white society. The conversion was supposed to be happening across the country at the dozens of federally operated boarding schools for Indian children. Between the 1880s and 1930s, an estimated 75,000 native children were sent to government schools for American Indians, many against their will. Their story is much more complicated and troubling than these strange photographs would make it seem. Native people faced enormous challenges at the close of the 19th century. The U.S. government had moved indigenous people from their lands to reservations after decades of warfare. Tribal nations had difficulty adjusting to being dependent on white society and finding the means to provide for the future. After the Indian Wars, the U.S. government created the boarding schools as an attempt to strip Native American children of their own cultures and transform them into members of white society. The schools were supposed to convert children to Christianity. Native people were not citizens of the United States, and the U.S. government had broken the legal promises of its treaties to respect tribal nations. Indians did not have many rights in American society and had lost land and freedom. Native children were caught up in a new system of U.S. control over indigenous people and stolen away in a program of forced assimilation. In 1879, Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt, a Civil War veteran, went to Congress to ask for permission to start a new school for Indians. He had been in charge of a prison where many Indian warriors were held, and he had gotten a new idea about how to deal with what the government called the Indian problem. He founded Carlisle Indian Industrial School, the first boarding school which was far away from reservations in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was a military-style school. His idea was kill the Indian, save the man. Pratt believed he was saving people from extermination and war by using this message of forced assimilation. Today, human rights law calls this cultural genocide and ethnic cleansing, but back then, Pratt was seen as a progressive. While they were at the schools, many forgot their native languages and their tribal names. Bill Wright, a Padawan man, remembered coming home as a child seeing his grandmother again. His grandmother was speaking Padawan to him, and he said, "Grandma, I don't understand you." To which she replied, "Then who are you?" He replied that his name was Billy, and she shook her head. "No," she said, "your name's Tattle." And Bill said, "That's not what they told me." Students had to figure out why whites hated native culture, why they would keep children from singing their songs and speaking their languages. There was a lot of abuse in the schools, physical, mental, and even sexual. In part, this was because most white Americans refused to see Indians as people like themselves. Pratt was not the first person to use education as a tool of assimilation. Henry Knox of Massachusetts was one of the reformers of Native American education in colonial society. He was a senior officer in the U.S. Army and fought in the Revolutionary War. Even though he worked with the Founding Fathers to make the United States a democracy where all men were free and equal, he didn't think this applied to Indians or African slaves. Later, Thomas Jefferson imagined educating the Native Americans so they could work for white people, not as equals. His government pushed Indians further off their lands as the U.S. expanded. When Pratt founded Carlisle, most Americans thought that the Native population would eventually disappear, despite the active resistance from Native people. At the schools, children were not really taught of what we think of as the important subjects of today. Students were given the message that they were inferior. In the schools, young girls would be taught how to cook and sew and do other jobs around the house, while young boys would be trained to do jobs like carpentry and farming. They all worked in fields and would be loaned out as workers for white families on farms in the kitchens. This was child labor because they would make them work and do these jobs more than learn how to read and write. This was one important violation of basic human rights too, because U.S. labor law prevents kids from working. There were also some very unsettling free time activities that emphasized the boarding school's philosophy, which was to tell Native American children that they were savages and that their culture was barbaric. Lucy Toledo, Navajo, remembered, "On Saturday night, we had a movie. You know what the movie was about? Cowboys and Indians. Cowboys and Indians. Here we are, getting all our people killed, and that's the kind of stuff they showed us. Schools had to have cemeteries because many children died from illnesses like tuberculosis and did not have defenses from diseases and were not fed or cared for in the right way. Many children struggled to retain their traditions. Daniel LaFrance, Mohawk, remembered gathering medicine with his grandmother. I could have learned much if I had paid attention to her, because as I grew older, she took me into the woods when she went to gather herbs, and she told me what roots and leaves to collect, and how to dry and prepare them, and how to make the extracts, and what sicknesses they were good for. So Native parents had their own ideas about education and their own philosophies about the rights and responsibilities their children should have as members of their tribes. Parents tried to defend their kids, but did not have the money to travel and did not have much power. Floyd Red Crow Westerman, a Sioux from the Eastern Dakota community, was taken at the age of 10 in 1946. He remembered his mother crying. He said it was hurting her too. It was hurting me to see that. I'll never forget that. All the mothers were crying. He became an artist and musician and activist in the American Indian movement of the 1960s. He later wrote a song about his experience using the words, "You put me in your boarding school, made me learn your white man rule, be a fool." He was part of a generation who used their experiences in the schools to push for full rights of citizenship and Indian sovereignty. He returned to his people and grew his hair long again and worked to restore the Sioux language and cultural pride. But things did change. In 1928, the Merriam Report, also known as The Problem of Indian Administration, was published. It was a study that included a survey of schools authorized by the Institute of Government Research. The author, Louis Merriam, called for a complete change in the system. Government officials finally recognized that Indian children needed to be kept in their home communities and that Native cultures could be a valuable part of the curriculum. Indians had obtained U.S. citizenship in 1924, which meant the U.S. government had greater obligations to protect and support Indigenous people. In 1934, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Indian Reorganization Law. The new act ended the destructive policy of allotment, which split up tribal lands and allowed tribes to create their own governments. As a result of these changes, students at the boarding schools were able to use them as a stepping stone to claim more privileges in white society. They got better educations and a new generation became civil rights leaders. There are still a few of these boarding schools left, and they have truly turned into Indian schools taught by Indian teachers. Today, schools give Native students access to their culture and help them become full citizens of their home communities and the wider world. This subject ties into rights and responsibilities because of the rights to students and the responsibilities of teachers to keep their students safe. It also relates to the importance of respecting cultural rights, of not interfering with the most basic human rights of people to raise and educate their own children. Indigenous people have fought to keep their families whole and preserve their sovereignty. In Canada, where the same school system existed, the government closed all the residential schools and has been working to repair the wounds from the theft of children. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was started in 2008 and asks Canada to remember the children. There have been marches, public events, and exhibits, and places where people could share testimony about the experience. Doing the same thing as Canada did would be helpful to the U.S. It would be a way to think about our responsibilities to repair the past. The violence of the schools still haunts Indian people. Native people defending their sovereignty and their history of struggle has a lot to teach us. Thank you.